And at that point, this launch on warning, launch under attack option was developed and was considered to be a temporary option. It was not considered to be a satisfactory solution for obvious reasons. The obvious reason is, could there be a false warning? But I think even beyond that, even if the warning is accurate, do you want a president, anyone, making decisions about the fate of humanity in 5 minutes?
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Today is another very special episode as it's being recorded in New Orleans during the American Physical Society's Division of Nuclear Physics annual meeting. Now that physics conferences are back to in-person, I will be recording more episodes face-to-face with guests who are attending the same meetings. Today, that person is Dr. Steve Fetter, who is giving a talk titled Nuclear Weapons and the Risk of Nuclear War. This is part of the opening plenary session on nuclear threat and mitigation. Just in case you were wondering, this conference is for nuclear scientists to share their research work, but I think having an opening session on nuclear threat shows the importance of these issues in today's world. I was delighted to speak to Dr. Fetter. He is a professor in the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland and is now Associate Provost and Dean of the Graduate School there. He has spent time working at the White House and at other U.S. government agencies and has received numerous awards for his work in nuclear security. Before we start, I want to thank Daniel Puentes for recording this episode and Impact 89 FM for additional production assistance. One thing I wanted to ask you about is something that I hadn't heard of until I started getting into the topic of arms control, which is the nuclear posture reviews. Could you explain what they are and who they're written for?
Well, the nuclear posture reviews started in the Clinton administration after the end of the Cold War. It was something that then Secretary of Defense Les Aspin had called for. And he observed that the end of the Cold War had basically meant we should rethink our whole nuclear posture. Why do we have nuclear weapons? Under what circumstances might we use them? How many do we need? Of what types? And how will we maintain them? What will we say about them, both to our allies and to our adversaries? The first one was done in the Clinton administration, and then every subsequent administration, the Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden administrations have done their own statement of why we have nuclear weapons, what purposes do they serve, what do we say about them? That's called our declaratory doctrine. Should we engage in any arms control agreements? And if so, of what types? What new weapons should we be building? And all of those issues surrounding our nuclear forces.
Were you involved in this first nuclear posture review?
I was. I worked for then Assistant Secretary of Defense Ash Carter. He later became the Secretary of Defense under President Obama. He was given responsibility for that first nuclear posture review. I was his special assistant, and for a time I had responsibility for creating the PowerPoint presentations that were given to the secretary and the deputy secretary and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the vice chairman on what the various options were for policies in every area.
Was it hard to get people to open up about how many weapons we had and where they were for that first NPR?
Well, I would say the main challenge is that the world was changing quite dramatically at that time. It was the end of the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And when you say open up, no, it wasn't hard to get people to open up because this was an entirely classified study and environment, and everyone had the clearances that were necessary. But it was challenging to get people to think in new ways about what the purposes of nuclear weapons might be and how many we needed, because it was just the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And what our relationship would be with Russia at that point was very uncertain. There were some people like myself who wanted to move very aggressively to reduce the number of nuclear weapons and the role of nuclear weapons and to engage with Russia in that process and help them to reduce. There were other people who were much more cautious, who did not want to move very quickly, who wanted to adopt more of a, let's wait and see how this turns out and let's hedge. Let's keep a lot of perhaps our weapons in reserve in case the relationship with Russia does not turn out to be positive.
So looking back after all this time since the Clinton administration, do you think the thinking has changed in these reviews, that we've gone away from Cold War thinking? Have we evolved from that?
Somewhat, but it's a slow and evolutionary process. I would say there's been a lot of continuity between administrations, and that the differences in going from a Democrat to a Republican have been modest, relatively modest. The Democrats, Clinton and Obama, have tended to emphasize the need to reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons and also focus more on nonproliferation and reducing the potential for nuclear terrorism, and also noted the role that our own nuclear forces have in discouraging other countries from pursuing their own nuclear weapon programs, the example that we set. Whereas Republican administrations have tended to emphasize the need for deterrence and the need for a somewhat stronger and more assertive nuclear posture, maybe more open to other uses of nuclear weapons to deter other acts by countries. But I would say those differences, I think they're very significant differences, but the numbers of weapons and how they're deployed, those have been very consistent in going from one administration to another.
So you said that Republican presidents emphasize different uses of nuclear weapons? Isn't there kind of only one use?
Well, everyone emphasizes deterrence.
Okay.
That the main purpose of our nuclear forces is to deter other countries with nuclear weapons from using them against us or our allies. So that everyone agrees is the main purpose. The debate is over whether it is the only purpose. And if it's not the only purpose, what other purposes our nuclear weapons might have. And so in the Trump administration, for example, in their nuclear posture review, mentioned the possibility of using nuclear weapons in response to a devastating cyber attack. By devastating, I mean one that would destroy infrastructure, that might take down the electrical grid. And that is a bridge too far for many of us, including me.
I'm sorry, it's a podcast, so you can't see the look on my face.
So people really want to emphasize the deterrence part of it,
Okay.
not the use part of it. But of course, unless you threaten to use a weapon, then you can't use it to deter
Right.
in that situation. So the calculation that officials are making is, well, if I say this, might it give an adversary pause? Might they be afraid that, if we do this thing, if we do a devastating attack against infrastructure, an attack with biological weapons, that would be another of the kind of gray zones. Maybe the U.S. will retaliate with nuclear weapons. And that has been the debate over whether it should be the main purpose, deterrence of nuclear use is the main purpose or the only purpose.
Because the president has sole authority to use nuclear weapons, then I can see this being a concern in the policy world.
Absolutely. And particularly when President Trump had that authority, I think people were legitimately worried. And, it's now on the public record that Speaker of the House Pelosi called the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on January 7th to ask whether there was any chance that the president could order a nuclear attack, whether it could somehow be restrained. She was very concerned about the fact that there was one person and only one person with the sole authority to order the use of U.S. nuclear weapons.
Has anything been done since then about this concern?
There have been a couple of pieces of legislation introduced that would affect the sole authority of the president to order the use of nuclear weapons. Neither of those are likely to go anywhere. Of course, an incumbent president is extremely unlikely to give up any of the authority that they have. And the ability of Congress to constrain the president is uncertain for constitutional reasons, because the president is the commander-in-chief and does have the constitutional authority and responsibility to defend the United States. I know that me and a couple of other colleagues, we did write an article proposing that there be concurrence by at least 2 of 3 officials, and that those be in the line of presidential succession, so that the vice president or the Speaker of the House, that they should have to concur in an order to use nuclear weapons, particularly if the order is in peacetime or for the first use. In those cases, there's really no reason that additional officials couldn't be consulted. But as things stand now, it really truly is up to the president, and the order is relayed through other officials, and the president, we expect, would consult with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, with the Secretary of Defense, with their national security advisor, but there's no requirement. There's no legal requirement. Military officers are trained to follow legitimate orders. So unless the order were seen to be clearly illegal, it's likely that it would be carried out.
When I was just feeling a little bit better about the world, thank you. I want to move on to something that's been called for in the last couple nuclear posture reviews, and that is nuclear modernization. So first, I think we need to talk about what's called the triad. So could you tell us what makes up the nuclear triad in the U.S.?
Sure. So there are intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, and in the United States, they're in concrete silos in a few states like North Dakota and Montana. In the United States, we have 400 of those missiles. They each carry 1 warhead. Those are the Minutemen ICBMs. And then we have submarines. We have Trident submarines, 12 of them, and at any given time, about 2/3 of them are at sea. They go out to sea for about 2 months at a time, and they are completely invulnerable when they're at sea. And each of these submarines has 20 launch tubes, 20 missiles, and each missile can carry 4 or 5 warheads. So this is a very potent force, and that is the core of the U.S. strategic deterrent. And then there are also bombers. In the United States, B-52 and B-2 bombers can carry nuclear weapons, although those bombers also have conventional missions, so they are dual capable, what's called dual capable. And that's the strategic triad. That is the bulk of the deployed U.S. forces. There are also a small number of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe that can be delivered by fighter aircraft, and those are based in NATO countries.
So we hear a lot about these tactical nuclear weapons. So what makes them tactical?
It's more the use than it is the size of the weapon. I think a lot of people imagine that a tactical nuclear weapon is a small weapon or has a low yield, but actually most of the tactical nuclear weapons that are deployed, especially those by Russia has a much larger stockpile, have yields that are about the same as the Hiroshima bomb, which destroyed a city and killed 100,000 people. So it's not necessarily the size, it's how they would be used. And the tactical weapons have historically been intended for use against deployed military forces like tanks and artillery, ships at sea. Whereas strategic weapons can be delivered from the territory of one country against the territory of another country, could target the strategic forces of another country or the industrial facilities or population centers.
You mentioned that the submarines is kind of the core of our strategic force. Is there a leg of this triad that is less important than the other 3?
Well, in my view, it would be the ICBMs, because our ICBMs are fixed targets. They're vulnerable to attack. We guard against that because they would not survive a Russian attack. We guard against that by keeping them ready to be launched in just a few minutes on warning of a Russian attack.
Wait, so we have 400 silos in the upper Midwest ready to be launched at the president's order.
Yes, within just a few minutes, and they would have to be launched within a few minutes. If they're not launched within a few minutes, they would be destroyed by a Russian attack. So this policy is what's called launch under attack by the proponents, by the opponents. It's called launch on warning, which sounds much more dangerous and ominous. They're really the same thing. And in fact, the US government has used the same terms in the past. And this was seen as being just a temporary measure. When the Minuteman was built, it was invulnerable because the Russian missiles were not accurate enough to destroy it. And that situation persisted up until the late 1970s, when Russian warheads became so accurate they could destroy the Minuteman. And at that point, this launch on warning, launch under attack option was developed and was considered to be a temporary option. It was not considered to be a satisfactory solution for obvious reasons. The obvious reason is, well, first, could there be a false warning? And there have been false warnings in the past. Now, fortunately, we have correctly recognized that every false warning was false. With plenty of time, there was no danger of a false launch. But I think even beyond that, even if the warning is accurate, do you want a president, anyone, making decisions about the fate of humanity in 5 minutes?
I'm going to answer that for, I think, everyone, and the answer is no, I do not.
And that's why I think it would be better to rely largely, if not entirely, on the submarine force, which I say is invulnerable. There's no urgency to retaliate. Those submarines could remain at sea for days or weeks and receive orders, if necessary, to retaliate. I also would keep the bombers because they are useful for other missions, and it is not much more expensive to give a nuclear option to a bomber. But also, if there ever were an occasion where a president might want to use just one or a few nuclear weapons, a bomber might be the preferred platform because you can retain control up to the very last moment. Whereas with a missile, once you fire the missile, it's gone. There's no ability to recall a missile after it's been fired.
Can you destroy it in the air?
Well, for missile tests, and anytime NASA launches a rocket, it does have the ability to destroy that on command in case the rocket or the missile's going off course. For a nuclear weapon system, we would worry that an adversary would figure out how to trigger that self-destruct mechanism. All the emphasis, correctly, I think, is put on preventing a false launch or an inadvertent or a mistaken launch in the first place, not trying to blow it up after you've mistakenly launched it.
I kind of see this as the old woman swallows a fly, then she swallows the bird to eat the fly.
The spider.
The spider and the fly, right? Because instead of recognizing that we have this temporary solution, and instead of saying, okay, it's outlived its use, we're now going to say, well, why don't we just use missile defense systems to protect our missiles and, try to figure out if some other missiles are coming in. But then there's a problem with that too, right? Because you can easily fool a missile defense system.
Well, in fact, we tried that in the 1970s. There was a system developed and actually deployed in North Dakota to protect our missile silos. It was shut down just a few months after it became operational because it would have been ineffective. And the sad reality is that nuclear weapons are so destructive that a defense has to be almost perfect in order to be worthwhile. And there are so many ways for the offense to trick or defeat the defense. Decoys, one of the most effective countermeasures to a missile defense is a nuclear detonation itself in space or high in the atmosphere. It blinds the radar sensors. It blinds the infrared sensors. And it was that realization that led, in fact, to the first arms control treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union was the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And it was a recognition by both sides that unless we limited defenses, we could not limit offenses, because the best way to defeat a defense was to build up the offense. And that really was a key. And now we're experiencing difficulties with Russia, partly because we gave up the ABM treaty. The George W. Bush administration withdrew from the ABM treaty in order to deploy missile defenses that it claimed were necessary against North Korea and Iran. But those missile defenses really worry Russia and China, and Russia and China cite them as reasons why they have to develop and deploy new systems and expand their nuclear arsenals.
Do you think those newly deployed defense systems, they work?
No. In fact,
you didn't even think about it.
Well, there have been not very many tests of this. So we have one national missile defense system, the ground-based mid-course defense system, which is based largely in Alaska. And it has been tested a couple dozen times. These are highly scripted tests. They're all in the daytime when the target is illuminated by the sun, and it's easy to see with an infrared sensor. There are no decoys or countermeasures or very unsophisticated decoys, and the defense knows all about the decoys in advance, so it knows what to look for, how the target warhead differs from the decoys. And even in these highly scripted tests, only half of the intercepts have been successful. So I think when facing a real adversary, someone who will not tell us when they're launching, who will not be kind enough to do it in the daylight, and who will be using countermeasures we've never seen before, the system's likely to be much less effective.
Sorry, I'm just a little shocked that we're spending all this money on something that obviously doesn't work.
It is hard to understand why, except it has become a kind of article of faith, especially in the Republican Party, that we can't rely on deterrence and we have to have a defense.
I mean, so going back to mutually assured destruction that everyone cites, it seems that that only works between two parties where there are no defensive structures.
Or the defense isn't so worrisome that you have to worry whether your force will be able to retaliate.
Right, so that doesn't seem to hold anymore.
Well, I think it still holds between the United States and Russia, although, as I say, Russia is now deploying several new weapon systems they say are to defeat our missile defense. I think this should give the Russians confidence in their retaliatory capability. We see China greatly building up their forces, and it's reasonable to assume they're doing this because they want to be sure that they will be able to penetrate our missile defenses. They don't want us to think that we are invulnerable, that we can threaten them or without worrying about the possibility of a Chinese attack.
I mean, I could totally be wrong about this. China had a no first use policy, but then they started building silos, and silos really are first strike systems.
Yes, that is one of the concerns. China does have a no first use policy. They're the only of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the 5 official nuclear weapon states. They're the only country that's adopted a policy of no first use. And the fact that they are constructing fixed silos is worrisome. They don't currently have, though, a warning system. So we have satellites in space, as well as radars that would detect any attack and give warning. And that is, in fact, that warning that would allow us to launch our ICBMs before they're destroyed. So China does not yet have this, but it looks as if they are deploying it. And that would be concerning. So not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a first strike weapon. It could mean that they're preparing to rely on launch under attack or launch on warning. But that, I would really worry about that. I think that is a very fragile situation when you have to make decisions in just a few minutes about whether to launch a nuclear attack.
In the nuclear posture reviews, it's been suggested that we modernize our forces. When was the last time that we did any sort of modernization?
Well, we have been continuously modernizing our nuclear forces all along. The core of the systems that we currently have were built in the 1970s and 1980s. So the Minuteman missile, the early 1970s, the Trident submarine, the 1980s, the B-52 bomber, that goes back to the 1960s, and the B-2 bomber, the late 1990s. Those systems have been improved since that time. The accuracy has been upgraded. The propellants have been renewed. But it was determined that the lifetimes of those systems could not be extended. A submarine, every time it submerges and comes back to the top, it's like blowing up a balloon and deflating it. It creates metal fatigue. And so it was determined that the Trident submarine had to be replaced. The Minuteman missile, I think, could have been extended in its life another 20, 25 years, but the Air Force wanted to build a new missile.
But don't they always want to build something new?
Yes.
So we have these three legs. Is it just coincident that they coincide with the three branches of the military?
Well, two of the current legs are the ICBMs, and the bombers are the Air Force. The Army no longer has any nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Maybe originally Interservice Rivalry could explain some of this.
Can't the Air Force just give up one? They still have the other?
Well, I think so. When these nuclear forces were first deployed, each of these legs had distinct advantages. So, of course, bombers were the original delivery vehicle before there were missiles. And then when missiles were developed, a land-based missile could be far more accurate and far more reliable than a sea-based missile. The sea-based missiles were small, so their warheads were small, and they were inaccurate. And also, there were difficulties in communicating with a submarine. And for all those reasons, we didn't want to rely largely or entirely on submarines. All of that has changed. Now, the Trident submarine is a huge submarine. The missile is a big missile that can deliver many warheads anywhere, and communication with submarines is reliable. So yes, I think now would have been the time at the end of the lifetime of Minuteman to say, we're going to transition away from these fixed targets that are vulnerable and force us to keep them on a launch-on warning posture that's just, maybe the probability of a false warning is very low. Why worry about that at all? Why not just take that off the table?
Right.
If there were no ICBMs, we would not need an option to launch on warning of an attack, and there would be more time for a president to make decisions.
And the other thing I kind of tie into this is that way back when we signed the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we wanted other countries not to pursue nuclear weapons, and then we agreed to work to reduce our nuclear stockpile. What do you think this says about our credibility in the worldwide community, that when it's the end of the lifetime of one of our legs of the triad, that we say, you know what, instead of reducing, we're going to create something new for the next 50 years?
I think it is a problem. The NPT is often described as a bargain, that most countries in the world agree never to acquire nuclear weapons, and we agree to pursue disarmament. And that is Article 6 of the treaty. And every administration since then has agreed that that should be the goal, that should be the objective, that we support disarmament. I think the frustration that the non-nuclear weapon states have is that they're not seeing any progress toward that goal. We saw tremendous progress at the end of the Cold War.
Yes.
The US and Russia from the Soviet Union reduced our arsenals by 90%. So tremendous progress. But that progress seems to have stalled. Both the US and Russia now deploy about 4,000 or 5,000 weapons. And we have no plans, concrete plans for further reduction, and both are modernizing their forces. And as you say, the US is building systems that will last 50 or more years, really almost until the end of the century. And so it is hard to say we take our commitments to disarmament seriously when we are rebuilding our entire arsenal at the current level.
Yeah.
I think it would have been good if we could have at least said that we're eliminating one of the legs of the triad because it's really not necessary and it poses dangers that don't really justify the deployment, or if we said, we're not going to plan these future systems, we don't need to deploy all of the weapons we currently deploy. We're going to plan for a force of, say, 1,000, because that is, in fact, what the Obama administration determined with the Joint Chiefs of Staff was adequate for U.S. security. And that was regardless.
A fourth of what we have?
Well, these are deployed strategic weapons. So currently we have about 1,600 deployed strategic weapons. So this would be a reduction to 1,000. When I said we have 4,000, that includes the reserve weapons and the tactical weapons. All of that adds up to 4,000. Of the 4,000, about 1,600 are currently deployed on the ICBMs and the SLBMs and the bombers.
But a reduction to 1,000 is still a hefty reduction.
Yes, and I think it would have demonstrated to the international community that we take this commitment to working toward disarmament seriously. It doesn't send that message when you're replacing everything you have. And in fact, in the Trump plan included some new delivery vehicles, some that we had previously retired, like sea-launched cruise missiles, equipping them again with nuclear weapons. So that would have been a step in the other direction. At least in the Biden administration, it's back to the old plan.
Do you think by pursuing these kind of nuclear modernization plans and not honoring this commitment in the NPT, that it hurts our credibility in other areas with the international community?
I think people do tend to see the United States as unreliable for various reasons. And hard to take our promises at face value sometime. Things like the withdrawal from the ABM treaty, the withdrawal from the Paris Accord, which I know is not nuclear weapons, it's climate change, the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. All of these are seen as, indications that you can't always rely on what the United States says. And that does affect our ability to influence the behavior of other countries, to get agreement to the treaties that we are favoring.
So it makes your job much harder.
Yes.
What do you think the chances are that we will be able to eliminate the U.S. nuclear stockpile in the next 50 years?
Well, 50 years is a long time, and a lot of things can happen. And of course, key is our relationship with the other nuclear weapon states, particularly Russia and China. Relations with those countries are so bad right now that both of them, it's hard to see how we would get to that point. But I think the end of the Cold War taught us that things can change very rapidly, very dramatically. I remember in early 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell, I did not believe that the Berlin Wall would fall. If people had said, in a couple of years, the Warsaw Pact will break up and the Soviet Union will be no more, I would have said that's a fantasy. That's not going to happen. But it happened. And I think we have to be ready to take advantage of these opportunities when they arise. The last time, we were not ready. We did not move quickly enough, I think, to seize the initiative. So as I say, 50 years is a long time. It's hard to see right now how it's going to happen. But I think it is possible, and I think we should be working toward it.
Do you think we have to change our Cold War thinking?
Well, I think the biggest obstacle right now is obviously the behavior of Russia in Ukraine, which basically has validated the utility of nuclear weapons in some people's mind. Certainly, Russia appears to be relying on them as a threat to deter our direct involvement in it. But other countries want to see how the United States will respond, and they want to know that if they're attacked with nuclear weapons, that the United States will have their back. Yes, I think we have to get beyond Cold War thinking, but I think the key to that lies in Russia and China. When you have authoritarian leaders who are bent, in the case of Putin, on territorial conquest, it's hard to overcome Cold War type thinking. I know that there are people who think we contributed to that by NATO expansion and other actions after the Cold War. Certainly Russia feels that we took advantage of their weakness after the end of the Cold War. Perhaps the United States did not handle that situation as well as it could have. And that's why I think this war is going to be over at some point. Putin is going to be gone at some point. Mm-hmm. And I hope we have a plan to take advantage of that opportunity to change the relationship between our two countries. And that will be the key to making progress, I think, on reducing nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear use.
If someone listening wants to get involved in nuclear policy or read more about these topics, where do you suggest they go?
Well, I can recommend two organizations that I'm affiliated with. The Union of Concerned Scientists, which has a global security program, does detailed studies on many of these issues, and has an active lobbying campaign in Congress and actively enlists its members in lobbying their representatives on key issues. Also, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which has an online journal, great stories that come out regularly. The Bulletin has a great lineage dating back to some of the physicists and scientists who were involved in the Manhattan Project and who were very concerned about the possibility that the nuclear arms race was spinning out of control and that nuclear weapons might be used. And in fact, you may know them from the Doomsday Clock that gets press every year, which is kind of a measure of how close we are to catastrophe.
And how close are we right now?
I think we're 100 seconds before midnight.
Is that the closest we've ever been?
It is.
So we're closer to midnight now than we were even during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yes, I have to reluctantly agree that the danger of nuclear use today is certainly as great as it has been at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you could argue it's higher than it was in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides were really trying to avoid war. Now there is a war going on, and one side is actively trying to raise the risk of nuclear use to influence the outcome. So I do think this is a very dangerous time.
So it's a good time to get involved.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for listening to this episode, and thank you to Steve, Daniel, and Impact 89 FM. There is actually a second part to this podcast. Daniel and I spoke to students about their reaction to the nuclear threat and mitigation plenary session, so stay tuned for that episode to drop. For more information, please visit our website at mynuclearlife.com or ask us a question or send us a comment at mynuclearlife@protonmail.com. To help us out, leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever it is that you're listening to this podcast. Until next time, I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.